This is Dale O'Shills, pastor of Church of the Redeemer in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Thank you so much for joining me for our devotional time. And we're talking this week about temptation. And I want to take you back just for a few moments to the book of Genesis. And in the third chapter of the book of Genesis, we have the story of the first recorded temptation and what we know to be theologically the fall of man. It's when Adam and Eve sinned against God. And there was a very subtle attack upon them. And that's what I want you to note about temptation. Temptation is the enticement to do something that is contrary to God's word, God's will, or God's ways. That's a very simple way to understand it. It's an attractive enticement to lure us away from obeying God's word, obeying God's will, or living God's way or ways. That's exactly what happened to Adam and Eve in the garden, that the serpent came along and lured them, threw out an attractive bait to Adam and Eve, and they followed that bait, bit into the bait, and of course we know the end result was a lot of devastation and pain, and not just for them, but for the consequences for the human race as well. Now, this whole process really, this subtle attraction, subtle attack of the enemy upon Adam and Eve really had two categories to it, two dimensions to it. And this is what I want to mention. It first of all came in the form of trying to get Adam and Eve to question the validity of God's word, to question the validity of God's commands. Oh, you know what? God didn't really mean this, or this doesn't mean what it says. And so oftentimes that's how temptation shows up in our lives. That the devil comes along or our flesh rises up and we begin to question the validity of God's commands and instructions. And what I would remind you of is that all of God's commandments are true and pure and right and just, and they're good for your life. Don't let the devil convince you that God's commandments are not valid or good for you. The second thing that happened to Adam and Eve is they then compromised their commitments. So they first of all questioned the commandments, and then they compromised their commitment. They had a commitment to God, but then after sort of processing these questions the devil threw their way, it brought them to the place of making compromises that led to their sin. They compromised even in their conversation with the adversary. So make the choice in your life to, just not disregard. Don't disregard the commands of God, and don't compromise your commitment to God. That's the way you overcome temptation.